allowing me to present here. I think it is far longer than the time I have, so I'm just going to sort of talk it through just a little bit. This morning I mentioned about how brainwashing is sort of a little bit antiquated idea, Cold War term, and I think there's a lot we have to rethink about when it comes to Korea. I teach a film history class, and I teach totalitarian studies through the film history class because we began with cinema around the late 30s into the 40s, following up after World War II. And I use a lot of good books on comparing and contrasting Stalinism with Nazism, the hard fascists, the hard communists, and what constitutes a totalitarian society. The thing about North Korea is it's an outlier. It's an outlier because in the paper that I have here, based on my research, it's a cult nation unlike any I've seen before. I've been to Cuba, I've seen Fidelistas who worship the cult personality of Fidel and Che. I've been to Eastern Europe, I was in Bulgaria, probably the first American ever to go there right after the fall. And there was still a statue of Stalin, sort of Stalinism worship. Obviously the Nazis had their Hitler worship. I've been in Austria in the 90s. I met a bunch of neo-Nazis, or maybe they were old Nazis, who loved Hitler and bragged about it in the beer garden. So I understand cult of personality. And obviously the Kim dynasty is cult of personality on steroids. But cult of personality itself does not make a totalitarian society. We have that in many of our quote liberal democracies today, where people glom onto political leaders and they'll follow them off the cliff wherever they go. But there's a qualitative difference. In the Soviet Union, you had dissidents. You had Semstai. You had this alternative underground discourse that went on. I was in Czechoslovakia under communism, and yeah, we got invited up to someone's loft, and they go like this, and they're looking around, and they're pointing about where we can talk in the house and where we can't. Whether they were mic'd or not, I don't know. But we still got to do conversations, all right? And they had alternative press. There were underground poems, underground literature. Solzhenitsyn had his literature that got smuggled out. You had many Russian intellectuals who were able to beat the system. You had a black market system. I don't know, North Korea, is there a big black market system, or is that pretty tightly contained within North Korea? Does anybody, what's the take on that? Anybody? If you know what a black market is? So in Russia, if I wanted to get a pair of Gucci, what are they, I don't even know, Gucci slacks, shoes, or whatever.
Purse,
A Gucci purse, which would have been illegal because it's hyper-capitalism, you could find one in the black market. Now, was it real or was it fake? It doesn't matter, but you could still find objects, plenty of places that I went to under communism in Russia where you could find all sorts of stuff. I'm not sure if that's the same in North Korea, where the lock is so tight. So here's my point. What separates North Korea as a totalitarian nation is I studied in preparation for this. I'm not an expert in cults at all, but I've always been fascinated by, like I said, totalitarian, totalizing ideologies and practices. Well, cults fall directly into that. And so as I studied it and I went down, the 10 principles, I don't know what the translation is in Korea, but there's 10 principles for Juche, right? Or for obedience to the state. I went down those 10 and I said, this is interesting. And you look at Jay Lifton's early work. Where's Red? RW, where are you? He's not here. Oh, I was going to talk behind his back, so I'm talking about, I'm just joking. He's still alive in Colombia. He was one of the first to, during the Korean War, American psychologists that were brought in to work with the brainwashed American soldiers. And I wanted to have him zoom in at this meeting here, but there was no room for him. And I think it would have been so historic. I think he'd probably cry to see this many North Koreans, because he was like one of the first around, late 50s, early 60s. Anyway, he developed a prototype for cult studies. And he developed it looking at a political system. Well, what happened in the 70s and 80s is cult studies went off into the Moonies, it went off into the Branch Davidians, it went off into, you know, Hare Krishna or whatever, where suburban parents were concerned that their young children were being sucked into these cults and the mindsets of it, right? But I'm working on a book on the demise of liberal democracy, and I just see political cultism everywhere I go now. It's probably my own cognitive bias, because when you start looking for a nail and you got a hammer, you're going to find a nail everywhere, right? But I do think we're living in an age of political cultism. So the concern this morning about indoctrination in our schools, yeah, but it's not the same. There's still alternative. There are still parents who go to school meetings here in America and Canada and yell and scream at the school board, don't put that book in the school. You can do that. You cannot do that in North Korea. There's absolutely no chance of disagreement, of dissent. And so in my paper, I list so many different traits of what constitutes cults and cult mentalities. Just get down the line, and you'll see that Korea is a cult nation, which therefore means what? It means that we need to learn from professional deprogrammers how do you get people to come out of cults. But here's the difference. If there's a suburban kid that gets caught up in a cult, and the parents hire a deprogrammer, and sometimes they kidnap them, but not even doing that. And the child comes home and says, yeah, you know, I probably made a mistake. But the child's all messed up, right? All different abuses that take place. That child has a reference to go back to. That child was not in that cult before they got sucked into it. So they have something to go back to. North Koreans have nothing to go back to. What are they going to go back to? We'll go back to, where's my lovely, there she is, okay. My partner down there this morning. They're indoctrinated from the womb, literally, all right? Do studies on babies. When I was at McGill or in Montreal, my girlfriend was a brilliant, probably one of the few geniuses I've met. As an undergrad, she was teaching our professors at McGill, which is like the Harvard of Canada, literature. Why? Her mother read Shakespeare when she was in the womb. All her life, she had Shakespeare like you can't believe, right? Babies pick that stuff up. Those North Korean babies in the womb are picking up with the vibrations, or whatever you want to call it, that's going on. So there's no reference to go back to. So we have to really be humble as Christian ministries and go to some of the secular people. What are the tricks, or what are the tips of the trade? How do you deprogram people that have been in, and they might not even know, all right? So in my paper, I thought that CBT, you know CBT, I met you last night, Jim, cognitive behavioral therapy with the BITE, B-I-T-E model, I think is interesting. One of my studies I do is narratology, or the storytelling, the theory of storytelling. And one of the things that we do in life, all of us, Walter Fisher, a famous communications theorist, calls human beings homo narrans, man the storyteller, or people the storyteller. But we are storytelling beings. I don't care, science is a story. It's a story. At the end of the day, you have to publish a paper, and even though it's filled with facts, even though it's filled with statistics and mathematics, it's still telling a story that has to be convincing to the people that bet that, right? So you have stories everywhere. Preaching is a story. Evangelism is a story. Politics is a story. Law. How did if anyone remember O.J. Simpson? What did he have? 1 in 3 billion chance of not being convicted? He just had better storytellers than the prosecution and got off. Courts is all about it, all right? The law. Everywhere you go, it's always about the story. Well, the North Koreans, and you guys are much more expert at it than I am, are loaded with stories from their birth. And I don't know the pronunciation. Mount Picatu, what do they call the famous mountain? How do you say it?
Pektusan.
One more time.
Pictusan.
Pektusan.
No.
Pictusan.
No, well, maybe it's
The legendary mountain?
I thought it was Peaktu. Huh?
Yeah, that's the same
But there's a mythology about that. That mythology precedes the Kims, doesn't it? That goes way back, probably what, at least 500, 600, 700, even 1,000 years in Korean culture. So they have a mythology around themselves, which is what? A massive story. And so North Koreans are constantly told stories that their leaders are basically gods. I mean, I don't know if it's rumored or not, but some of the Kim family defy gravity. They're able to, better than Jesus, they can turn the ocean into wine, let alone a few baths, right? I mean, literally, they get told this, and here's the rub. If you were to meet a North Korean, and they were to say, yeah, Kim Jong can defy gravity. He can actually levitate. And you're going to say, no, it can't happen. Sorry, it doesn't work that way. And they're going to square up with that he can. And you're going to say to yourself, ooh, how? Where does this come from? It comes from being so embedded into what I'll call biorhetoric. What's biorhetoric? Biorhetoric deals with the way in which thoughts dictate bodily or neurological reaction. In my naive younger scholarship days, when I was working on biorhetoric, I went to a conference in Amsterdam on the placebo effect. Everybody know the placebo effect? That it throws pharmaceutical companies, it drives them crazy. As much as 50 and sometimes more than 50% of the time, if they gave you this pill, and that pill was actually really nothing but sugar water, and then they gave you the actual medicine. In the study, as often as high as 50% of the people got healed by sugar water equal to the pill. And so in my naivete, I go to this conference in Amsterdam, and these people are the world experts. And I raised my hand the first day out and I said, oh, hey, by the way, guys, I'm here, and I'd like to know, what is the mechanism? How does the placebo effect work? How can a belief in something create actual physical changes in the body? And you know what they did? They laughed at me. But they didn't do it viciously. They said, we've been studying this for 20 plus years and we can't figure it out. It is a miracle at some level. So the Koreans have so embedded the persuasive rhetoric of their culture that it's embedded in their body, it's embedded in their being. And for them to deny a belief is going to have physiological consequences. We have a lady here, she calls herself the lab rat, but she knows that, right? That when you go through trauma is going to be expressed through the body. You're going to need medical doctors, right? You're going to need therapists, psychotherapists, family. You're going to need so much healing because these people are I don't call it post-traumatic stress disorder with Korea, I call it present or continuous stress disorder. They're constantly stressed out. And they're going to live off adrenaline, endorphin, cortisol, whatever. I learned this morning, a nice term I'm stealing from my lab rat here, of internal addiction. That people get addicted, and it's true, endorphins. Any text monkeys here? That's what I call my students. They sit there and just text all day long, right? And then they get an endorphin rush from texting. That's why social media is partly why it's so addictive. And it truly is. You can measure the brain. So, in this process of healing North Korea, it's going to take way more than we could ever possibly conceive of. And if there's anything that my paper does, is to open up that avenue, to say, no, you're dealing with a colored nation. And there's never in the history of the world has there been a nation like that. You can find maybe worse tyrants, sure. All right, Mao killed, 70 million? All right, Stalin's good for, 30 or 40? Hitler's good for at least 20 if we count the war. All right? Way more people have been killed by other vicious dictators, psychopathic dictators, but they didn't have that type of system that the poor North Koreans that were brought up in. And so, in my paper, I say, victim is thrown around all over the place. They are victims, but it's not their fault. You got to have mercy. And here's the rub. I know this is hard, but as a Christian approach, there's going to have to be a lot of forgiveness toward the leadership. Because guess what? Those generals and the captains and the police and all their special forces, they're as much victims as the poor people, right? So here's something else that I thought about. Cults use, quote, mind control. And they have many different techniques. Sleep deprivation is one, right? Shaming sessions are another. But as I was studying this, I thought, probably the biggest and most powerful technique that the North Koreans use on their people to control them is hunger and starvation. Because when you starve somebody out, they lose any ability to be a critical thinker. I was on an island at a survival school for 3 days when I was 18, and I drank peanut butter and pizza all night long after the second day. All I could think about was food, especially 18-year-old boy, right? When you starve people out, that is a massive, or the fear of starvation. And when you go to the gulag, they call them gulags, whatever the gulag, penal prisons and colonies. When you're shipped to one of those, you're going to just be starved. They're going to give you soup at best. So when you can control a population, it's less, they don't even have the energy to pick up their pitchfork to go break down the barriers. Who's going to come in from the outside the city? They're like walking zombies almost, right? So they use, in addition to the continuous use of songs, the continuous use of shame sessions, those things are pretty common in any cult. But most cults don't intentionally starve out their people to death. And they abuse them to death, but they don't starve them out like that, right? So again, we're dealing with a different ballgame here. So what I'd like to suggest is, through cognitive behavioral therapy, is to understand how North Korea shapes its the cognitions of the mental worlds, the mental understandings, it's called epistemology. How do they know what's real? How do they know what's valuable? They're constantly given basically 1 or 2 stories. The regime is right. The North Koreans are the best in the world. And then they're given the idea, don't trust anybody else. It's us versus them continually, right? We heard that this morning, and we hear it all the time, right? And so they control the emotions, they control the thoughts, they control the behavior of the people in massive ways. So how are we going to help these people? This is the beauty of the body like this. In Corinthians, Paul talks about, not everybody's in here. Not everybody's an eye or an ear. The church has many different ministries. It's going to take many different approaches and many different types of approach. And that's where a whole slew of specialists, and probably specialists maybe we don't even know about yet, that it's going to take. And so this type of conference is pioneering. It's trying to find, you talk about the calm, chaos, collapse, catastrophe, whatever C word you want to throw out there. But to rebuild that nation, you're absolutely right about the minds. I've been in a couple war zones. Those minds are not nice things to be around, right? And even today, every once in a while you'll see in Europe where some kid gets killed from a mine that's still left over from World War II. Think about that in Europe, Western Europe and Eastern Europe. So there's going to be such a cleanup job. And in some ways, I don't know, do we pray for a fast collapse or a slow collapse? And my lovely State Department friend over here, what's going to be the solution to it, all right? And it's going to take politics. It's going to take everything, right? So one of the things I would suggest, though, that can help is, and I'd love to talk to the North Koreans about, I just floated a couple different techniques taken from cognitive cognitive and behavioral therapy, that to see, is it possible? And I know some of them will be really threatening. Put a picture up and have any one of the 3 Kim leaders, and have a North Korean tell that North Korean leader what they really think. For us, that might be easy. You know, you can get a picture of your boss and window and take a fist and punch your boss's picture and feel great after, right? That's not going to happen in North Korea. Not going to happen. That's later therapy. It might need to come to that. I don't know. But I think the best way to start is reframing. What story can be told? And this is where the people who are refugees and defectors and who have escaped the regime, what story won you over? What story helped you to understand better? And I think we heard last night someone said that someone's been out of the country for 20 years and still will not even utter the name of one of the Kims. Think about that. Okay? So that person has still got a lot of stories going on inside their head. They're not very healthy. So I think we have to really, really ask, and obviously the Christian message and the Christian and the gospel story is the best. But I was talking with someone at our dinner table last night, and my wife and I, Don Richardson from Peace Channel fame, if you know, and he was one of the first sensitive anthropological Christian missionaries who understood when you're with a tribe, like in Borneo, and they don't know what a lamb is. What's the Lamb of God going to mean to people who don't even know what a lamb is? But they were able to he found a correlation of a sacrificial peace child in the culture, and they understood, oh, that's what Jesus died. Oh, he's the ultimate peace child. Bingo. So I don't know what it is in North Korea. And this is where North Koreans can come in and help and say, what's the correlations that we can find that can help to open up the possibility for people to let go of those highly negative narratives that are totally influencing their thought, their emotions, their behavior, their relationships, right? And that's where you don't meet. That's where there's got to be this important dynamic and dialogue between North Koreans and those that want to help the North Koreans. And again, lucky table last night for me, but there was someone here from the ministry that specializes in missionary innovation. Well, this is like missionary innovation, Uber style, not the driving style, but Uber style. So that's what I would just offer in my talk, is to simply say, this is way bigger, nothing like it in history, all right? And yeah, we know the reality is going to be tough, but it's really going to be tough. And not to be pessimistic, but to be realistic. And I think you have to be realistic. Otherwise, it's going to be overwhelming. So anyway, I think I'll leave it at that, and we can take questions. But I'd like to really hear North Koreans what they think is going to be the best let's call it the peace child approach. What can help liberate North Koreans to understand the power of Jesus, to understand the power of crucifixion and resurrection and salvation, when basically their God, or gods, 3 of them, have said that's all a myth. That's all, American propaganda or whatever is going to be said as. Anyway.
We have a